Our scripture reading this morning is going to come from two places. The first reading I'd like to give you is from 1 Thessalonians chapter 4. I'm picking up in 13, and I'm going to read through verse 18. And Paul writes, "But we do not want you to be uninformed, brothers and sisters, about those who have died, so that you may not grieve as others who do have no hope. For since we believe that Jesus died and rose again, even so, though through Jesus, God will bring with him those who have died. For this we declare to you by the word of the Lord, that we who are alive, who are left until the coming of the Lord, will by no means precede those who have died." And the second reading is from John 14, and we get the words of Jesus himself. "Do not let your hearts be troubled. Believe in God, believe also in me. In my Father's house there are many dwelling places. If it were not so, would I have told you that I go to prepare a place for you? And if I go and prepare a place for you, I will come again and will take you to myself, so that where I am, there you may be also. And you know the way to the place where I'm going." And then Thomas said to him, "Lord, we do not know where you're going. How can we know the way?" And Jesus said to him, "I am the way and the truth and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. If you know me, you will know my Father also. From now on, you do know him and have seen him." Friends, for both of these readings, we give thanks, and may God add a blessing to it, to our hearing, to our understanding, and to the living of his word. Welcome back. Final week. Maybe some of you are saying, thank God, of our sermon series on aging and getting older. And if you remember way back when we started this sermon series, we talked a little bit about intergenerational relationships. And as we age, right, older folks tend to complain about younger folks, and younger folks try to complain about older folks. And we talked a lot about things that we have in common between generations and ways that we can continue to get along and get through one another, and better ways that we can communicate in making that effort. The next week, we talked about, as we get older, the need to be caregivers, Christian caregivers. And we have the example of Jesus taking care of his own mother, even as he died on the cross, and the urge to honor our father and mother. And then for Christians, that certainly means in times when their bodies can no longer take care of themselves. And then as Christians, ethically speaking, we do all we can to take them into our homes and care for the needs of our mothers and our fathers. We talked a little bit about how sometimes we even get too old for church, as we talked about last week, and that church, and with the changing times and changing people, that even church itself has changed. And we often ask those questions of, where do I fit in this whole thing called church? And we talked a lot last week about how we fit in here at Crossroads United Methodist Church. And I hope I sparked maybe a few ideas for you, and hope that I expressed to you that truthfully we need you, anybody, regardless of their gift, because God has blessed us all and graced us all at every season of our life to be a blessing to others and into this world. We talked a little bit about a few weeks ago, and you missed it here online, about what it's like to take care of grandkids. And we also talked about what it's like to parent adult children. And the main thing we talked about there, right, you're never too old to admit that we've messed up, no matter how old we are. And we never, never, never get too old to bridge those gaps and to find reconciliation with maybe even our own kids that we have had arguments with in the past, and that we should always, as stubborn as we are, try to seek forgiveness and reconciliation, especially for those divisions in our families and with our children. We're never, ever too old. And we're never too old to hear the stories of the prodigal son and call them back to us. Now, today's topic, I'm going to warn you, is perhaps the hardest one out of all of them. And though I couldn't even think of a good way to begin this topic except through this way. And that is, when I was a kid, I had my first pet. And his name was Fisher. And yes, I was uncreative, and he was a fish. And he lived in a goldfish bowl, and my dad won him at a carnival when I was 3 years old. But suffice it to say that that carnival fish lived about 10 years. A long time. I swear to God, longest living carnival fish in the world. I named him Fisher, Fisher was great. We got used to seeing Fisher in the bowl, and we kept him right underneath of the microwave, and I don't even know if that was completely safe. And sometimes it would look like he was going to die, but he would always come back, and he would look like he was going to die, but he would always come back, until one day, Fisher didn't come back. And it was sad. It was heartbreaking. It was one of the first losses I had as a kid. And you go through the initial shock of just the thing dying and having compassion and emotions surrounding the loss of that fish. And then there's another part of the grieving process that comes with coming down for breakfast the next day and, Fisher's bowl's not there. Or you're used to seeing it. Or the habit that I had of going and feeding him, it was almost just like, for 10 years you go over to the drawer and you pick out his fish food, and you no longer had to do that. And you'd think, oh, I could just go straight and grab my cereal now. I didn't need to stop and feed Fisher. And that would bring back memories of having done it the day before. To say that our topic today is on loss. And it's on grief. And it's on this fact that as we get older, we get closer and closer to the realization, or perhaps even for ourselves, that we're only here for a temporary period of time. And that all of us are mortal beings, and that someday we're going to pass that great gap of eternity to go live with the communion of saints and God forever. But with that comes a lot of apprehension and a lot of fear. Quick diversion here. If you go back to the beginning of time, if we remember back to our early Sunday school classes, and we know that story of Adam and Eve, and this story kind of tells us that we are made in the image of God, made one for each other, and one to be in relationship with God, until we came and messed that up by entering sin into the world, and then all of that was unbecoming of what it meant to be made in God's image. Hence, God initiates a whole plan to mend us and the entire universe, and ultimately through His Son, through the law, and then ultimately through His Son, Jesus Christ. And I take that diversion to say that death, and something I wanted to start with, death was not part of the original plan. And that in a perfect world, in the perfect world that God created at the very beginning, He created Adam and Eve as co-equals, as co-laborers in the Garden of Eden with Him. And everything in that state of being was meant to be in a state of being in God's righteousness and right relationship. Like I said, one with each other, one with God, and one with all of creation. It's a perfect, love-filled world. But death was not a part of God's original plan. Enter sin. Perhaps one of the hardest things to describe in this whole book. That if you were given the perfect gift to be in relationship with God and have abundance and happiness and right relationships with everybody, think no arguments, no war, no pain, no malice, all the food you could ever eat in right relationships with animals and creation and everything else beautiful that you think you can imagine. And we somehow decided, the story shows us, entered into that distrust, pride, and sin. For what reason? Who knows? It, again, is one of the hardest things to describe, that sin would enter such a perfect world. But if the Bible and the Scriptures are to be trusted, it was certainly us who broke that in. And ever since that, every sin and every action that is taken, all the way back from Cain and Abel then, to us not being able to see and love our neighbors as ourselves, and not hearing the cries of the needy, and everything else, systematic racism and every sin that applies today, all stemming back from that very first sin, is unbecoming of how God made us to be to begin with. And that if in the image of God we were created at the beginning, all the sin that broke into this world, of which death is a consequence, is unbecoming of what it means to be made in God's image, as I said, hence God's plan to mend the entire universe and to us. To think of it in terms of the way Jesus said in the Lord's Prayer, on earth as it is in heaven, heaven is a place where God's will is done and we love perfectly, and heaven is likely a lot like Eden. And that it's a perfect place in which we can exist in balance with each other and with God. Now, Where am I going with this? What happens? I want to throw this in here. What happens? I get these questions. What happens when I go and I'm asked, Pastor, so-and-so passed away. Could you come make a visit? Or so-and-so is close to death. A lot of the questions that I usually get up front, and some of them are harmless. They come from kids, they come from adults, and questions come from and they span the whole gamut, but they're questions like, well, what's going to happen when he or she dies? Pastor, will I get to see my dog when we get there? And believe you me, friends, I'm pretty sure that when I go, my dog, because there's a contest at my house who gets to be at the door first. When I did there, my dog is won every day for the last 10 years of her life. Right? My dog will probably be the first one to greet me. I believe that. So let that be where it is. Pastor, I get questions. Pastor, I had a woman ask me, will my horse be there? I hope she is. Pastor, will there be trees there? I think, if death wasn't part of the plan, but I would imagine I would like to see these things there. They're all beautiful things, right? God made creation and He made it good. Will the trees be there? Will there be flowers? Will there be animals? Harder questions come. Pastor, my dad never went to church. He didn't believe in God. Will I see Him? Harder yet. A father whose son had just overdosed, I walked in to do the funeral, and with tears in his eyes, he hugged me and said, tell me where he is. Do you think he's all right? I want to start with this because there's a lot in there in what I just said, and there's a lot of things we can discuss, and a lot of which I don't have the time to get into today, but let it suffice to say this. Friends, not only do I believe in heaven, but I'm counting on it. I believe in heaven because Jesus talked about it, and Jesus talked about it a lot. And I believe in Jesus. And in the same way in John 14 that Jesus says that because you know me, because you know the Father, because I know Jesus, I know God. And Jesus helps me see God. Jesus helps me see other people better. Jesus helps me see God better. Jesus helps me see my creation better. And because I believe in Jesus, I believe in heaven because it's something that He talked about, and talked about quite a bit. And was concerned by the fact that other people should know about it as well. Jesus demonstrated to us that there is an afterlife by His own resurrection. And He said that because I live, right, as we read, you shall live also. Now, why a lot of this is important as we talk about aging can seem obvious, right? Answers those obvious questions of, Don, what's going to happen? Where do I go? Do I get to see my dog, my dad, my son? I wanted to bring a lot of this up to offer you a little quote here from C.S. Lewis that says, if you believe in an afterlife, it will change how you live this life. And perhaps one of my favorite prayers says, God, may we take the future promise that we have in you, in heaven, and put it into our present work. And here's what I mean by that. That as Christians and as ones who believe in Jesus Christ and can take the promise that He has for us in heaven to live in right relationship and perfect love and harmony with others and with Him, in that we should bring that same spirit, those same things into our lives now. And in one of the ways that people do that, I had lunch with a gentleman this week who was recently retired and couldn't quite figure out what to do in his retirement. He said he did about everything that you could do or thought that he wanted to accomplish in retirement about 6 months, and then he got quickly bored. And so we picked up a job over here at a local hospital as a patient transporter. And when I'd asked him, it seemed the hours were very early in the morning, and so he's got a very early morning, a 0 dark 30, as we used to call it in the Army, to get there. Well, why'd you pick up a shift like that? And he said, well, my mom's death was a long, drawn-out process, and one of the people she actually ended up getting very close to at the hospital was her patient transporter. And I got to know him pretty well, too, he told me. And he said one of the beautiful things about this guy, whose sole job it was just to move a patient from point A to point B, they would often strike up conversations with those who knew were dying and wouldn't be around much longer. Talk about baseball and sports and everything else. And he said he brought such a smile to my mom's face. And he said, I took that job because that's what I wanted to do in retirement. In a way, he saw himself as a servant and almost shuttling people from this life into the next and bringing smiles to their faces where they may. A little bit of heaven into this life here now. What a gift. What a perfect gift. And there's many different ways I think we can take that concept of heaven and Eden and think, or maybe you even know somebody. Someone you know who wasn't just satisfied with the promise of heaven later in life and instead took that promise that we have of heaven and brought it here into this life, in the here and the now. I know a few people like that, and maybe you do too. But if we talk about heaven, we also have to logically talk about this thing that nobody wants to talk about, which is this thing called hell. And at the apprehension from this gentleman's voice when I walked in to do this funeral for this guy, his apprehension that he was feeling, and his question and asking, Don, tell me where he is. He was looking for some kind of certainty here. Now logically, there has to be a there. And then if in the Lord's Prayer, Jesus says that on earth as it is in heaven, and heaven is a place where God's will is done, remember, and we love perfectly, but there must be a place for those folks who don't want to live that way. Let me say that again. There has to be a place, or is likely a place, where folks don't want to live that way. And that God doesn't force us to experience heaven or do His will. Going back to the creation story, sin entered the world in Adam and Eve, and they realized that they were naked, and all sorts of floods of emotions that would then fracture all of creation from here on until now flooded their minds and their body. They realized that they were naked. And then the scriptures tell us that God begins to walk during the cool evening breeze looking for Adam and Eve. Now, the best phrase I've ever heard about this picture of God looking for Adam and Eve would be the same as Sherlock Holmes looking for a murderer in a phone booth. God knew exactly where they were, but instead of coercing or forcing Adam and Eve out after his heart was just broken as to what they did, He asked a simple question, where are you? Offering the invitation for Adam and Eve to respond, and it's the same invitation all of us have each and every day of our lives. But there are folks who might hear that call and not answer, but God allows us, right? God does not coerce us, does not force us to experience heaven or do His will, and that heaven is something through which everyone is invited, but we still have a choice in this. I often think of hell as a place of hunger, but where no fulfillment comes. Or perhaps C.S. Lewis put it best when he said, hell is a place where the doors are locked from the inside. What we think about the afterlife often matters to the way that we look at this life. And I want to leave you today, and I've already left you with a lot to think about, I know. And I hope to have future conversations with you about this, but I wanted to leave you with perhaps some practical advice, if I could. That while I get questions that I enjoy answering, that we might not have complete certain answers to, but I'm telling you, my dog's going to greet me there. And do you believe me? We're going to see our pets there, and trees, and all the beautiful things that God made, and that God made it good. And I'm excited for those things and those moments, and to see people that I've loved very dearly in this world. But perhaps some of the bigger questions, and the questions that don't necessarily get brought up, that I see on people's faces when you enter these scenarios in which folks are passing from this life into the great life and the next is, well, what do you do when that happens? What do you say? For most of us, we don't lose the loved ones closest around us every single day. And so oftentimes in the silence, people just wonder, well, what do I do? Do I hold their hand? Do I sing a song? Do I say a prayer? And I want to offer up a little bit of practical advice, if I could, for this sermon, and end that way, and to say there are a couple things that you can do to bring heaven to somebody's life who's near the end. The first piece of practical advice is, don't feel like you have the right thing to say. You probably don't. But let the person who is passing on that side of eternity express their feelings. Undoubtedly, this is the place to begin, whether they're feelings of fear or grief or sadness or loss. Don't be afraid to let people express their feelings in those times, and be a sounding board to sit and listen and affirm those feelings of fear and of pain. The reason I loved the story of the guy who decided to spend his life being with dying people, just transporting from one place to another, is because it gets that practical piece of advice number 2 for you, and that is, be there as someone to help them overcome the loneliness in that moment. Mind you, as someone who's dying, if you could put yourself into that perspective, you're under the care of a home caregiver, or you're in a hospital room, and what you see is that you are the only person in that room going through that experience in that time. There's an amount of loneliness to it. So by letting them express their feelings and being there physically to show them that they are not alone in this time, because as good as that promise is, and as good as the words of Jesus is, and as strong as our faith is, sometimes the physical and emotional toll that the body takes as it goes through its end-of-life processes can be extremely hard. So it takes a community of people being there to help our loved ones overcome the loneliness of passing from this life into the next. Reassure your loved one that their life was meaningful. Every person, no matter who they are, wants to know that what they did in this world, the people that they loved and the things that they did weren't for naught. And this experience is necessary for building or bolstering esteem and a sense of community in that time, to realize that their life had meaning and worth. 4th piece of advice. There is meaning in the present moment. As we talked about a few weeks ago with folks who have dementia, and whether it matters for us to remember our faith and even you do Eucharist or acts of communion and pray and anoint their heads with oil and have prayers over, whether any of that matters, of course it does. It matters. Find meaning in people's present moments, because despite the legacy of one's life, when we get to the end, oftentimes folks who are passing can tend to have a narrow focus. Help them to find meaning in those present moments. Include them in the plans for what comes after. Advice number 5. It can be awkward to have conversations with people because you don't want to conjure up feelings of loss and grief, but at the same time, offering up, listening to them. How would you like your service to go? What songs would you like sung? What scriptures would you like to be? Who would you like to be there? Would you like to sing would we like to hear a Conway Twitty song? Any of that lets them have some sense of control as to what happens next. Lastly, help them come to the realization that it's okay to let go of life. Because as good as this life is, friends, and it's good, the scriptures told us in the same story with Adam and Eve that God made creation, and He made you, and He made me, and everything around us good and abundantly good when He added more people for us to be here with, and that was very good. Heaven's probably a lot like Eden. Let them know that letting go in this life and at the final extremity of dying, when these things have already been discussed, that we can assist our loved ones with a behavior and an inclination that it's okay to let go, because we know as Christians that we never let go of our lives or our other lives and realize that they are not then handed off and embraced by the one who put the stars in the sky. We have a hope. As Paul says back in verse 13, But we do not want you to be uninformed, brothers and sisters, about those who have died, so that you may not grieve as others do, who have no hope. Praise God that we have hope. Friends, not only do I believe in heaven, but as I said before, I'm counting on it. My favorite way to end a funeral is to read John 14. The house with many rooms that we're all invited to. Everybody on this earth is invited to. My favorite way is to end and take that person's life, right, and put it into it. And so depending on how that person was, and I think back to my great-grandmother Lily, who's, if you can imagine, had a very small house, but it was always very full with relatives and who knows, whoever passed by, right? I read John 14 and I can see my great-grandmother in that house with all of the relatives still there, hosting the parties and the bridge games and the Christmas parties and everything else. I can see it. I can see her smiling in that room, waiting for one of us to come by and sit and stay a while. It's my favorite way to end. Is because C.S. Lewis and Jesus was right. What we think about the life hereafter means how we live today. And in how we think about heaven, think about the most beautiful moments in this life as extending into what it is today, only better. And drawing that connection. And friends, it shouldn't be enough for us. The promise that Jesus Christ offers us in a life with Him and God in the hereafter, to simply be satisfied with that promise. But as Christians, we live as a hope and giving people hope to let go of the life here and now, but also to let go of the life here and now so that we can begin living a kingdom and a heaven life in our lives in the here and now. Said the same way that I said before, to be people who take our future promise and put it into our present work. A life of goodness and abundance and of mercy and of grace and of forgiveness and of hope in the here and now. Let us not live as people who do not have hope, so that you may not grieve as others who have no hope. For we have, friends. And not only do we believe it, but we count on it. Friends, thanks be to God for that beautiful hope.